How do
So,
you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
well,
How many people saw his body, right?
Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected
resurrection.
Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15. These are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus' ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said.
Well, it's been acknowledged far and wide that Christian apologist and textual scholar Wes Huff pretty much humiliated Forbidden Knowledge founder Billy Carson in an online debate, so much that Carson himself didn't want that episode to be made public. Well, this got Joe Rogan's attention, and he invited Wes Huff on his show. Now, it's a great discussion for lots of reasons, but especially because Joe Rogan asked Huff a great question that I think every Christian ought to have an answer for. So check this out, and then I'd like to highlight a few things on the post side.
Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think happened? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
How would you answer that question in your own life if somebody asked you? That's a great thing.
Well, I think so. As a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So, but it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out. Literally the end.
Yeah.
Last couple of days. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So,
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus' ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And you go from a bunch of scared guys who, because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
That within the lifetime of the people that actually saw these things, that's very, very important, and that's become more and more verified in scholarship.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case very recently where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead, and this guy started moving again and came back to life.
Okay, that's my worst nightmare now. I don't know what story he's talking about, but if that's true, that's like the worst thing ever.
Very, very bizarre case, because his family had been told that he was going to be harvested for organs. They were preparing for that. And this guy comes back.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion. And we
Pretty
know
brutal.
that, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing, atheist, agnostic Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity. So one of our earliest, in fact, not one of, the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross is called the Alexamenos Graphido. And it's probably from the end of the first century. And it's it depicts an individual with their arms raised in an act of worship, worshiping a man with a donkey's head who's being crucified. Whoa. And right beside it, it says Alexamenos worships his God in Greek.
Whoa. And that's a great thing to know about. You can find that picture online pretty easily.
It's mocking, right? Because crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for like slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified.
Who was it that got crucified upside down?
Peter.
Why? Was it because like regular crucifixion wasn't good enough for him, or what didn't deserve it because Christ had gone through it?
Well, so the story is that they say we're going to crucify you, and he says it's like too big of an honor to die like my Lord, and they say, well, we can fix that.
Oh, Jesus! Shut your mouth, buddy.
Listen, the Romans were pretty brutal.
Oh yeah, man.
But this is why we know, like we have. It's interesting. We know a lot about crucifixion, but crucifixion was seen as so disgusting. I believe it was Cicero who said that like the word crucifixion shouldn't even be on a Roman man's lips. Wow. I mean, the word excruciating,
right.
Ex is off of in Latin, and crus, off the cross. Oh, so that's where we get that word, is because this was designed to humiliate, and it was designed to be as painful as possible. There was actually a really good article done by JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was done by a number of, I think it was in the 70s or the early 80s. It was done by a group of biblical scholars and then medical professionals. And so they looked at the conventions of what we do know about Roman crucifixion, and then they looked at the descriptions in the gospel to try to figure out, okay, if we could diagnose how Jesus died, how would he have died? And so they basically came up with this idea that he probably asphyxiated to death. You kind of drown in your own blood. But the chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine, I mean, if the first thing you do, if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's right. Get me to a hospital.
Yeah, and these are very, very important things to understand and point out. The first thing as they get into this conversation, imagine yourself being asked that by someone if you're a believer. And earlier in the conversation, they had talked about Joe Rogan is open to the possibility of supernatural things, what we would term as supernatural, and most people are. Not everybody, but I think the majority of people that you encounter, even if they're not Christians, the universe is mysterious enough and has enough spiritual to it that people acknowledge the spiritual. And so he does take him back to that. And if the spiritual exists, this supernatural exists, is it really impossible for someone to rise again from the dead, especially someone like Jesus who talked in the way he did? That's the first thing. It's kind of a worldview idea. But the second thing is really about the objective history of it. He says that it is an historical question, which it absolutely is. We study history in a certain way. We look at documents, we listen to eyewitnesses from the time, we process all this, and we see how close the text is to the actual events. And the New Testament, without question now, is written within the lifetime of the people who saw those things happening. So these claims that Jesus would have been risen from the dead could have been debunked by people who were around at the day. The most people said back then were things like, well, they stole the body. They tried to explain it. They didn't deny the actual thing itself, and that's very, very important to know as well. And then it's a great question. Well, maybe he didn't die. I mean, maybe that's a good explanation for things. And we do know, and I've heard this said, and I think it needs to be reinforced. Even the most skeptical scholars that you're going to find will, most of them will say, one thing we can know about this guy named Jesus, he lived in the first century, he was a Jewish rabbi, and he died by crucifixion. We know that because back then, that wasn't considered a positive. That was considered the ultimate in negative kind of things, which is what he's pointing out, knowing that he did die. So we need to keep that in mind. But I think having those principles kind of on your mind and on your heart, and starting with Jesus, his personality, and then his resurrection, you can work out from there and kind of build up your confidence about other things in the faith that are a little bit more difficult. But I would encourage you to check out the entire conversation here. But also, we have an animated video that we've done that kind of helps you break down some of the basic, really important to understand evidences for the resurrection, that if you know them and understand them, you can have conversations like this with a little bit more confidence, and you don't have to have the level of education that a Wes Huff has. Hope that helps. See you next time.